Hey everyone, it's Luke, aka Sky Guy Customs, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create your very own Captain Rex helmet from Star Wars The Clone Wars. Now this is a super sweet helmet. I'm going to show you how to make it completely from scratch, walk you through the 3D printing process, how to sand and smooth your helmet, as well as how to paint it and get that super cool, weathered, battle damaged, accurate looking helmet. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the first thing you're going to need is a slicer. A slicer is a program that lets you convert digital files into actual things that you can print. I'm using one called Cura. It's by Ultimaker. It's super great. It's free to use. So go ahead and download that for free, and then we're going to hop over to Etsy or any place that you like to get files from and pick out our files. Now we're going to go ahead and open up Cura, and you can see the print bed here. The size of the print bed will vary based on the type of printer that you're using. So I've got mine set to a CR10 V2. Here you can see I'm opening up the main body of the helmet, checking it out. So it's grayed out right now, which means that it's not within the boundaries of the print bed. And as you can see on the interior of the helmet, there are these indents that come from the cheeks and the back of the clone helmet. Part of the design that forces you to scale the helmet up a little bit, because otherwise it won't quite fit. Those indents are pretty bulky on the interior. I scaled mine up to 104%, and you can see me checking here a bunch of different orientations. None of them quite fit, so we're not going to be able to actually print this thing in one whole piece. Instead, I'm going to print it in 3 different pieces: the face, the back, and the dome. I'm using a program called Mesh Mixer to chop up these files, which I'll cover in a different video, but you can find that program online for free as well. It's super easy to use. Just plain cut your files and then drop them in. So here are some of the settings I like to use: standard quality, 0.2 layer height, standard number of walls, top and bottom. All of that is just the presets. I like to use a 10% infill, and the style of infill is really up to you. I choose gyroid. I've got Z-hop when retracted to prevent the nozzle from hitting any supports. And then we're actually going to deselect generate supports. And once we've got the file in here, we're going to click on this little button at the bottom and insert custom supports. Now, this is a super handy tutorial that's going to save you a lot of filament. Shout out to VaultFox for explaining this and giving a super comprehensive run through of how to set this up. I'm going to link her video on creating this custom support feature in Cura in the description down below. So take a minute, go check that out, get this feature added, and then you can come back here and start adding supports to your file. So here I'm just going around with supports of a couple different sizes all around the helmet, making sure that I get any super substantial overhangs. There are, of course, some pieces like on the dome that won't require overhang supports, but for anything like the visor or the teeth or the base of the helmet, you want a nice sturdy support structure. Now, once you've got all your supports added to your file, you can go ahead and slice it. Here you can see this one's going to take just a little over 4 days. That's pretty standard using the settings that I have set. Here I'm just renaming it Rex Face so that it's consistent within my SD card. And then here are the back as well as the dome. Again, as I mentioned, the dome actually doesn't require supports. Although there's a red graphic, it will print by itself, so don't worry about adding supports to the dome. And then here are all the accessory pieces. Alright, with all the files sliced, we can eject the SD card and go plug it into the printer. So here I'm going along leveling the bed using a node card to test the distance between the nozzle and the print bed, and then turning the wheels up or down depending on if the nozzle's too close or too far away. I'm doing a couple passes of this in all 4 corners as well as in the center of the bed, And now I'm just chopping off a little chunk of the filament and going ahead and plugging that into the printer. This is one of the reasons why printing the skirt is such a great idea. You can see these differences in sort of around the exterior, where the first layer turned out to actually be a little bit unlevel, but as the print was going, you can just turn these knobs a little bit and sort of correct as you go, and then you can see that the first layer it's printing now is looking really good. Okay, the printers are cranking away, so we're going to keep monitoring them every so often over the next few days, and once the pieces are ready, then we can start sanding. So now that our pieces are finished printing, we can go ahead and pop them off the build plate. Now, for a printer like the CR10V2 with a glass bed, if you just wait for this to cool down, the print will actually just pop right off with no tension whatsoever. If you try to take it off while the bed's still hot, it's going to have a lot of resistance and you can damage the bed trying to scrape it. So just let it cool. It should honestly take only like 20 minutes or so it's pretty quick. If you've got a different kind of printer like an Ender 3 Pro that has a magnetic bed, you can lift the magnetic piece off and bend the plate, and that'll help the piece pop right off. So we're just going to take these off and then we can start assembling our prints. Here I'm using a pair of pliers to pop all the support pieces off. You want to take this slow, take your time, make sure that you get all the supports and don't crack the helmet at all. And then once all this is clean, we can start assembling the prints. Okay, so now that all of our pieces are printed and we popped off the supports, we're going to take some really rough sandpaper and some super glue or any other adhesive, E6000, steel stick, any sort of bonding adhesive, and we're going to use that to join our pieces together and create a full helmet. Now, while I'm working on connecting those pieces, I also like to heat up the soldering iron, and we're going to use that to melt the plastic and bond it together, sort of like welding, honestly, just to give the whole helmet a stronger connection. After giving everything a nice scratch with the sandpaper so that it's rough and easier to bond with, you're going to dab super glue or whatever adhesive you're using around the seams pretty comprehensively, and then attach them, and if you're using a soldering iron, use that in tandem with the super glue or adhesive to melt the pieces together and create a whole helmet. Okay, now we can start working on smoothing out the layer lines on the helmet. To do that, we're going to use Bondo, glazing, and spot putty. Applying it to the helmet, giving it a nice thorough coat all throughout, and that's going to help us eliminate layer lines. Now this stuff is pretty nasty, so you're definitely going to want to use gloves while you're applying this, because you do not want this stuff getting all over your skin. And the fumes are pretty bad, so it's a good idea to have a mask or a respirator that you can wear while you're working on this. So let's get to work. Okay, so now I've finished coating the helmet in Bondo. It's all got one cohesive coat. There are no open layer lines, everything's looking good. And now we can start sanding this. So there are a couple different tools you can use to sand your helmets. I prefer to use sanding sponges. Different grits, usually between 80 and 120, kind of alternating those between layers. You can also use a mouse sander or some sort of motorized sander. That's going to be a lot faster for you, but it's not going to be able to get in those crevices like a sanding sponge is. So this is up to personal preference, whatever you want to use, one or the other, a combination of the two, or something entirely different, totally up to you. There is going to be a good amount of dust no matter what you use, so definitely have a respirator on, because this stuff can be pretty toxic. So now we're going to get to work sanding, and we'll check back in after that. So we've got our first round of sanding done on the helmet, but before we can spray it with primer, we need to get all the particles off. So put that respirator back on, and we're going to use either a towel or, like I'm using, a leaf blower to clear off all the dust on this thing. Now our helmet is coated with Bondo, and we've sprayed off all the extra dust, so you can see there are some layer lines kind of showing through there, but for the most part we've got it coated, and now we're going to hit it with primer to make it even smoother. So we're going to take our 2-in-1 filler sandable primer and give the whole helmet a nice comprehensive coat. Alright, so it's the next day. The helmet is totally dry and smooth. The primer is fully cured at this point. This stuff actually cures really fast. It'll be dry in like 15-20 minutes on a day with really good weather, so you don't have to wait this long. I've just been working on a different project over here, full suit of armor. Working on that at the same time, so I let this sit overnight, but now it's good to go. You can get to work sanding it just like we did with the Bondo. Okay, so with the first layers of Bondo and primer on, the majority of the helmet should be feeling really smooth to the touch. You should be able to run your hand over it and not really feel any layer lines. But now we're gonna go back over and repeat the whole process. I know that might be a little disheartening to hear, and if you're anything like me, after a couple days of printing, you just want this project to be finished. You want the finished thing that you can hold in your hand and look at because it's awesome. And Bondo and primer and sanding over and over again can get a little boring. But it's important to remember with a project like this that the result is going to reflect the effort that you put in. So the more time you spend perfecting this, making it seamless, making it super smooth, the better it's going to look in the end. And I think that that is sort of all the motivation that you need to keep going. So once you've got these two layers on, you're going to want to inspect the helmet for problem areas. And these are normally the top of the helmet. You can see where the layers sort of finish up out here. The dome is normally going to have some pretty evident layer lines that we're going to want to fix up. If you print in multiple pieces, you're going to have some minor seams. Here you can see I use the soldering iron, so we're going to want to go back over that for sure. Same thing on the other side back here. There's a little bit of a seam, so we're going to want to fill that in. Along here on the dome, sometimes along the visor area, and then of course on the bottom there's all this gunky stuff that we're going to want to fill in. And obviously that's assuming that your print is perfect. 99% of the time you're going to have some sort of error with your print. In this one there was a tiny layer shift right along here, so we're going to also hit that with a line of Bondo. So pick out all of your problem areas, maybe mark them so that you remember you don't forget any of them, and then we're going to hit them with Bondo like we did the first time around. Okay, so the Bondo is cured and I sanded it down again. As you can see, I used two different kinds of sanding sponges, the same 80 grit that I was using initially, and then a finer sandpaper just to smooth it out even more. And now that it's fully smooth, we can move on to painting. So I've got this cheap foam mannequin head here. This thing is great for painting because it allows you to get underneath the helmet and spin it around so you can manipulate it and spray from any angle that you need. These things are super cheap. You can pick them up online for like 20 bucks. But anything like this or a bucket, whatever you can set the helmet on will be perfect. So in terms of painting, I'm a big fan of Rust-Oleum colors. A lot of them are 2-in-1 paint and primers, and they dry super fast. So if you're impatient like me, it'll only take like 15 to 30 minutes for this to dry, and then we can add the next layer, which is a huge bonus. So now I'm going to set the helmet up on the little mannequin head and give it a nice even coat of this. You don't want to go too heavy on your first coat, just like with the primer, because then you'll get runs. And once you've started painting, trying to clean those things out and sand them down is a total pain because you have to basically start the whole process over again. So 2 to 3 light coats of the base color, and then we can move on to the highlights. So as you go to start painting, you want to make sure that you really shake up your can. If you start painting too soon, you can gunk up the can and ruin the whole thing. And then once it's ready, after a minute or so of shaking, you can start spraying. So the first coat should be light enough that you can still see the Bondo through it. It should not be too heavy because if so, you're going to get runs, as I mentioned, and that's a huge pain. So we just finished up the first coat of white. As you can see, it is not comprehensive. You can still see a lot of the primer and Bondo through it, and that's actually good. We want that because that means we didn't go too thick on the first coat. It means we got a nice coat, but not one that is going to create any runs or anything. And this is also good because later on in the painting process, when we're scratching up the helmet, making it look weathered and battle damaged, we want multiple layers so that the scratches don't run through into the primer. They're going to scratch off the blue and the other colors, and they're going to reveal the white. If you just do one heavy coat, it's actually going to scratch all the way through that white as well, and you're going to be left with spots that are either gray from the primer or pinkish purple from the Bondo. So let this dry for 5 to 10 minutes. It doesn't need to be perfectly dry, and then we're going to hit it with 1 to 2 more coats. So after taking a look at some reference photos, I settled on a couple different colors for the helmet. Like I mentioned, I used a 2-in-1 white Rust-Oleum primer and paint for the base coat, and then for the attachments, I'm using a dark gray as well as a black, and those are going to be for several different pieces. You can see here I have all the rangefinder attachments, and those as well as the bolts that go on the interior of his cheeks are going to be dark gray, and then these little greaves on the front are going to be black with a light gray highlight. Now I'm actually not too worried about a thick coat on these pieces because there's quite a bit of weathering on Rex's helmet, and it's all a lighter gray color, so I'm going to do a light coat of whatever color goes on these pieces and then sand off the weathered areas to reveal the light gray of the primer, and I think that that'll give it the right color effect. Alright, so we've given the white base coat some time to dry. It's all good, finished. There's no clear runs or anything. It all looks comprehensive and clean. So now we're going to get to work adding the other colors. Now when I was looking through some reference photos from the show, I noticed that Rex actually has a gray thin line running throughout the top of his helmet, right where the face meets the dome and around the back. It's only the flat part on top. It's not the sides or the actual dome itself. And so rather than spray that on or airbrush it, I'm just going to hand paint that line because taping that would be a nightmare. Obviously you could paint this in any other way, it's just a personal preference thing, so I'm just going to go ahead and paint in that gray line. As you can probably tell, I threw this line on pretty haphazardly. It's messy along the sides, and that's okay. That's okay for a couple of reasons. A, because on the face, above the visor and down here is all gonna be blue, so I'm not too worried about that. And up here on the dome is his welding marks, so all of that is gonna be covered up. And for the back part, I want it really weathered to give it some character, so I'm gonna be scratching away a lot of this. And all in all, it's gonna end up looking all right. So don't worry if it looks a little messy at this point. Okay, so now we get to move on to one of the most time-consuming, but also one of the most rewarding parts of the process, which is taping. So taping up the helmet takes a couple of different things. For the detail work, I like to use thinner types of tape. I got this 5-pack of various widths of tape on Amazon for like 10 bucks. Super cheap, gives you a good range of options depending on how much detail you need. And then you need a thicker tape to block in the rest of it. So for example, Rex has a blue outline along the visor. The rest of the helmet is not going to be blue, so we want to preserve that white. To do that, you can either load it up with a thick tape like this, or use another piece of paper and cover up the helmet, and you can pick whichever one works for you. Taping it up will take a little bit longer, paper will be a little bit quicker. It's a trade-off. So with that said, we're gonna get to work taping and start working on the blue. Okay, so now we've got the main outline of the blue done, but before we paint it, we obviously have to cover up the rest of the helmet. We also need to add the jag eyes that go on the dome of the helmet. But to do that, you absolutely can tape them off. It's going to take a little bit more work because getting them symmetrical is going to be fairly tough. So I'm going to use our machine called the Cricut and cut out some stencils that I can then place here, tape down, and paint over. So here I'm grabbing some clear stick down acrylic material that will be used for the stencils. Now I'm taking some measurements on Rex's dome, cutting out the piece to the correct size, and then we're going to let the Cricut cut out the design. Place it down on the mat, make sure it's stuck down fully, and then the machine will go to town, cutting everything out just like the design has it. Once that's ready, we can peel it off, pop out the pieces so that it's just the stencil area we need, and then peel this off and stick it onto the helmet. Okay, now with the stencil cut and centered into place, we can start taping off the rest of the helmet and then paint it blue. Okay, so the helmet is taped up and ready for blue. I've gone over the whole thing, covered up all the areas that aren't going to be blue, and then patched up any little holes in between those pieces of tape. Now, it's good practice to cover the entire helmet in tape or paper, depending on what material you're using. Just something to cover the whole thing so that you don't risk any paint from tainting the rest of your project. So now we can go ahead and get painting. For the blue in the helmet, I'm using Rust-Oleum Brilliant Blue. I think that this is a really good color for 501st. Now, the other thing that you can do before painting is throw on some toothpaste. It might sound a little weird, but this is how you're going to get a cool battle damage paint chipping effect. It's going to make your helmet look weathered and worn and really, really cool. You can use any material. I like to use toothpaste, but you can use liquid latex, mustard, any sort of thick but washable material like that. And you can apply it with a paintbrush and just dab it on. And after we spray the blue on, we can wash away the toothpaste or whatever material you're using, and it'll reveal the white underneath. So I'm going to follow along with some reference photos and add some of this onto the helmet. So here you can see the toothpaste applied in a couple spots along the visor. Now we're going to go ahead and give it a blue coat. Okay, so now that the blue paint has dried, we can get to arguably the most satisfying part of the whole process, which is removing the tape. Alright, so the Rex helmet is looking awesome. We just took the tape off, so we have the blue, the gray line, and the white now on. Now we're going to go ahead and wipe off the toothpaste. So to do this, I just like to go a little bit at a time, getting a napkin or a piece of toilet paper a little wet, running it under some water, and then just wiping the toothpaste off. Okay, so we just finished taking off all the toothpaste, and here is the finished product. You can see all those little chipping marks on the jag eyes and around the visor that make the blue look worn, battle damaged, and really, really cool. So next we're gonna go ahead and work on painting in Rex's weld lines that go along his cheeks. So for those of you who don't know, Rex actually welded a Phase 1 visor into his Phase 2 helmet in Star Wars, and so it leaves these little weld marks on both cheeks and around the top where the face meets the dome. Now, to get that look, I don't want it to look super straight, so rather than just taping on directly and getting this perfectly flat line, what I'm actually going to do is take a piece of tape and rip it in half, and this is going to give us a line that is semi-straight but has all of these little unique intricacies and like bumps and peaks that's going to make it look like it was welded on. Okay, I locked in the rest of the tape for the weld lines. Now, I'm going to use an airbrush to paint these on. You can definitely use spray paint, you can hand paint these, anything you want. I'm just using an airbrush because it provides a little bit more muted colors if you go lighter on it than spray paint would. And that's kind of what we're going for with the weld lines. I'm also not going to worry about toothpaste for these since weld lines aren't really something that would erode over time, so we don't want chipping paint here. We're going to weather over it and everything, but we want them to look consistent. Okay, so here's my little airbrushing setup. I've got the door open to outside for good ventilation. I've got this little guard for painting, and then the compressor and the airbrush off to the side. Now, the main color for Rex's weld lines is sort of a pinkish tan, so I'm going to be using a mix of ochre and flesh. I'm going to combine these about 2 to 1, 2 ochre to 1 flesh, to get that color that we're looking for. Okay, so I've got my airbrush and my paint. The compressor's around 40 to 50 psi, and we can start spraying. Now there are actually several more colors on Rex's weld lines. There's a light blue and then a white line that runs throughout it. But since those are going to be so small, I'm just going to hand paint them on rather than worry about airbrushing or spray painting again. And now for the big reveal. Okay, so the weld marks are on and it is looking really cool. We've got them running down the face and then up through the cheeks and onto the dome and across, and the same on the other side, and it is looking really, really sweet. Next up, I'm going to keep on hand painting some of the more intricate details that aren't really necessary to spray paint. Interior parts of these, the ear cap here, his kill count markings, and then we'll start attaching pieces. Alright, so now that all those details are painted in, we're going to work on gluing the pieces onto the helmet. We want to do that before we weather so that you get the shadow effect around the rangefinder and all the different pieces. At this point, I'm also going to take some pretty rough sandpaper and scratch up the helmet to give it a bunch of more battle damage and make it look weathered and everything. I'm going to do that for the main helmet as well as the extra pieces. Okay, now we're going to start attaching the pieces to the helmet. To do this, I like to use a hot glue gun. It's quick, it's convenient, but you can use whatever adhesive is best for you. So I'm going to start with the little greebles that go towards the bottom, and then try to center that up and pop it in. I'm going to do the same thing for the next one. we can do the central piece that goes on the chin. Next we'll do the little bolts that go in to the sides of Rex's cheeks. So a little bit of hot glue inside the rangefinder body. And we'll do the same thing, putting the shaft into the earpiece. Got yourself a Captain Rex helmet. So now I'm going to put the visor in. Normally I would do this after weathering in a clear coat, but since the hot glue gun's already ready to go, we're just going to go ahead and do it now. So for visor material, I use Selstrom visor replacements. These are actually for welding visors. You can find them on Amazon for super cheap. They've got a green tint to them, but inside the helmet it's going to be totally black. And so we're just going to go ahead and cut this to the right size for Rex, and then put it inside the helmet. We're also going to go ahead and put in a little bit of mesh netting for the mouthpiece. This is going to go right behind the teeth, and that's going to allow you to breathe through the helmet, keep it dark, but also prevent it from fogging up. Alright, so at this point we've got a completed Captain Rex helmet. If you like it clean like this with just the scratches and the chipping paint, you're free to totally wear it like this. You've got the visor installed, the mesh netting within the teeth, so perfectly good to have the helmet like this. I do recommend adding a clear coat, a matte clear coat, either way. That's going to tie the whole thing together, get rid of any glossiness. One thing that I'm going to add is some weathering. So now I'm going to airbrush it with some black lightly over the whole thing. It's going to give some shadowy effects in the recessed parts and make the whole thing look even more worn. Okay, so I've taped off the visor so that the black paint doesn't corrupt it at all. And now I'm going to start with airbrushing some Vallejo Air Black. This stuff is great. It's fantastic for weathering. You can get a super light coat, super dark coat, as many passes as you want to do. It's going to give you a super cool shadowy effect. So we're just going to hit the whole bucket around with this. And last but not least, we're gonna give it a clear coat. I'm using a Rust-Oleum double coverage matte clear coat. That's gonna get rid of any glossy looks and bring together the whole helmet. Make sure if you already installed your visor that you have it taped up right now, because you don't want this covering the visor and then making it hard to see out of. So give this a coat and then wait 15 to 20 minutes. It's pretty fast dry, and then your helmet's ready to go. All right, so the clear coat is dry and Rex is done. I'm really happy with how this helmet turned out, and I hope that you guys are too if you followed along. Keep in mind that all of these practices and tips apply to any helmet that you're making. So if Rex isn't your vibe, then don't worry, because you can add these tips and tricks into whatever helmet you want to make, whether it's a Mando, a different clone, whatever. All in all though, this is a sweet helmet. I'm really happy with how the weathering came out and all the little details. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.